morning is a statement from the UUA President, Peter Morales, on the President's question of proposed attack on Syria. In response to the use of chemical weapons by the government of Syria, President Obama is asking for congressional approval for U.S. military intervention against the Assad regime. I join all people of conscience in condemning the use of these weapons and grieve for the appalling loss of life. I urge the Obama administration to explore and then exhaust all peaceful diplomatic efforts to bring an end to the ongoing violence in Syria. Not enough has yet been done to rally international support for nonviolent response to the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian conflict. The Unitarian Universalist Association joins with many other faith groups in urging our government to refrain from the use of military force at this time. I also realize that there are times when limited military intervention is appropriate to prevent a greater tragedy. Inaction in the face of slaughter is not a moral option. The situation in Syria might, at some point, require some form of U.S. military intervention. I pray that this will not be necessary, that peaceful methods can be found to safeguard the lives of the innocent people of Syria. A new dispensation. On Thursday, the New York Times published a chilling photograph on its front page. The photo was a still from a video smuggled out of Syria. In it, a line of 7 soldiers stood in battle fatigues, each with an automatic rifle. In front of each soldier was a shirtless, kneeling man, head on the ground, arms bound behind him. The soldier at the right of the picture was the commander of the unit. And the caption said that he was reciting a revolutionary poem. The caption also says that immediately afterwards, the video goes on to show the commander shooting his prisoner in cold blood, and then all the other soldiers doing the same with their prisoners. And these were the supposed good guys. The soldiers in fatigues were all rebel troops, the half-naked prisoners, all forces fighting for the government of Bashar al-Assad. It does not make one enthusiastic about U.S. military intervention on behalf of such forces. Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, was on Wednesday of this week. The day marks the closing of the books on the year just passed, and the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are to balance the books, to settle accounts for the past year. There are offenses committed against other humans, and for these one seeks to make amends. Then there are offenses against God, and for those one seeks to atone on the Day of Atonement. The word atone breaks down into at one. Where there has been a rupture in relations, atonement seeks to bring the parties back together. I frankly don't know how healing can happen in a country where such brutality is being wrought. Yesterday afternoon, I opened this sanctuary for an hour in coordination with the other churches in town to allow people to come in and pray for peace in Syria. It seems like such a small gesture in light of what is going on. There's such suffering right now in Syria, and the military is active in Egypt as well. There's a network of alliances that include the U.S., Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Hezbollah, Israel, Hamas. It is hard to see the conflict doing anything but escalating whether or not the U.S. makes airstrikes, and especially if it does. Happy New Year. Welcome to the year 5774 on the Jewish calendar. We come together this morning to pour our waters from the summer into a common vessel. But what we need to do as well is to pool our wisdom. We have been through exhausting wars. We've been through long, draining wars that proved to be based on false information. We had a senator in South Carolina who was fond of saying, "There is no education in the second kick of a mule." At this time of taking stock, we might usefully think about the notion of Tikkun Olam. In contemporary Jewish life, Tikkun Olam means roughly what we mean by social action. But it comes from the Kabbalah, the mystic Jewish tradition that dates back to the 15th century. In that scheme, God first withdraws from the world, and then there's a primordial man who has light emanations coming from him. Some of the vessels carrying this light are broken, and it is up to humans to repair the broken vessels. The repair of the broken vessels of light is Tikkun Olam. There's a story from Martin Buber's Tales of the Hospi. Rabbi Baruch's grandson Yehiel was once playing hide and seek with his friend. He hid himself well and waited for his playmate to find him. After waiting a long time, he emerged from his hiding place to discover that his friend had gone home. Now Yehiel understood that his friend had never bothered to look for him, and he cried to his grandfather over his friend's faithlessness. Rabbi Baruch cried as well. Even God cries, says the Majid. God says, "I hide, and no one wants to find me." The Bible tells of God's covenants with the Jews as his chosen people, but in their history, the Jews have often found themselves oppressed, dispersed, even murdered. So a central problem in Jewish theology is the Shekinah, the absence of God. Tikkun Olam provides an explanation of God's absence. Shekinah. God is absent until the broken vessels are restored. In restoring the vessels, humans actually build the body of God. Now, what does any of this have to do with us? I haven't explained it in enough detail for you to decide whether you agree with it or not. So why am I telling you any of this anyway? Well, I've found that UUs in general tend to make a big distinction between social action and spirituality. Social action is over here. It's meetings and pamphlets, door-to-door petition drives, and endless organizational debates. Spirituality is over here, in solitude or quiet reflection, and has nothing to do with action in the world. But I think the two are inextricably linked. Social action needs to have a spiritual focus. What we are doing in working to realize our values is nothing less than redressing an imbalance, healing a wound, making the holy, building God. Now let me shift gears. In conservative Christianity, there's this notion called the dispensation. Many read the Bible as dividing history into periods called dispensations. We move from one dispensation to the next through the divine will as shown in history. There was a dispensation in the Garden of Eden, and then an expulsion. Noah's flood was a dispensation. Jesus' death on the cross enacted a new dispensation, which defeated death for those who believe. In the book of Acts, the appearance of tongues of fire on the apostles started the age of the Christian church. There was a preacher named Darby in the early 19th century who worked out a very elaborate scheme of dispensations based on his reading of the book of Daniel and the book of Revelations. And he started the theological movement called dispensationalism. You may know them as the rapture people who claim to have a detailed knowledge of the end times. Dispensationalists in the U.S. may number as many as 40 million and have been a factor in elections and in foreign policy. They take seriously the predictions of a great battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, as detailed in the Left Behind series of novels in the 1990s. Contemporary dispensationalists are strong political supporters of the State of Israel because they believe that the end times will start with God restoring the Jewish people to their rightful status as the chosen people. They would look with favor on on a general conflagration in the Middle East, for that would be a sign that the end times are upon us. What I prayed for alone in this sanctuary yesterday is some kind of new dispensation, rooted not in apocalyptic prophecies of the Bible, but in the respect for national sovereignty and the hope of strengthening international systems of peace and justice. This is my Tikkun Olam, my New Year's hope for turning a new leaf. The administration is trying to make the case that American credibility is at stake, and we should launch an airstrike because we threatened to take military action against the Syrian regime if they use chemical weapons, and now they have used them. So far, we've gotten our allies to join us in condemning the use of chemical weapons, but not to support military action in retaliation. Instead, the Western allies have counseled patience and letting the UN inspectors complete their investigation. We are not bound to follow through on military action with unforeseeable consequences in a booby-trapped environment because of ill-considered words spoken months ago. This is now. That was then. Secretary of State Kerry, in his appearance at the Senate, dismissed the UN inspectors on the basis that they are not telling us anything that U.S. intelligence doesn't already know. This chillingly recalls the similar short-circuiting of UN processes by G.W. Bush that led us into a very expensive and prolonged war in Iraq on the premises that turned out to be totally false. President Obama, as a former constitutional law professor, should understand that beyond the particular findings the process may afford, there's a great value in having the UN finish its assessment job. While Russia and China may be able to block any UN resolution for action, UN processes are still very important symbolically to the rest of the world. It does not help our standing in the international community for us to snub the institutions, however imperfect, set up for dealing with international disputes. If the Assad regime is responsible for the chemical attack, then that regime has broken the Geneva Conventions. But it does not follow from that it is the U.S.'s role to punish the violations. No one has elected us policemen. And we don't have the luck, money, guns, or scriptwriters to be the Lone Ranger in the world. The Lone Ranger, of course, never killed anybody with his gun blade. He was so skillful and fast, he could always shoot the gun out of the bad guy's hand before the bad guy could shoot the innocent and beautiful daughter of the honest and hardworking rancher. But that scenario was in the imagination of the scriptwriters. A new dispensation would be a frank acceptance by the politicians and the people who vote for them of certain limitations on American power. One, that the policing of the world should be placed in the hands of international organizations. Two, that the war on terrorists does not justify wholesale invasions of privacy of all citizens of America and the world. Three, that a single country cannot use military force to punish violations of international law unless such violations directly affect that state. Now, I hasten to add that the problem with America rejecting the role of world policeman is that it is not at all clear that any international body will fill that role effectively. And therefore, the states will feel free to commit genocide or develop weapons which threaten their own people, their neighbors, or all of humanity. As President Morales said, sometimes inaction is not an option. Therefore, America should take the lead in making international institutions more effective. This is why we need to let the UN inspectors do their work. Tikkun Olam, healing the world, building God. My prayer is that a new dispensation will lead us forward into an era of international cooperation, justice, and peace. We learned of the death this week of the great Irish poet, Seamus Heaney, who in his lifetime was a witness to intractable sectarian strife in his native Northern Ireland, but lived to see it resolved in peace. So I will close with this great meditation on peace, an excerpt from a long beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong, inflicted or endured. The innocent in jails beat on their bars together. A hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard, dumb. The police widow in veils faints at the funeral home. History says don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Call the miracle self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its turn. Happy New Year.
Shalom.